Can you hear me in the back? Great, thank you. Thank you and welcome everyone. It's great to have you here today and to move on with our third panel. Introduce myself briefly and then introduce some of our moderator and also our speakers on this panel. So my name is Wafaa El-Sadr. I'm the Executive Vice President for Columbia Global, and I'm a professor of public health and medicine at Columbia University. And it's a great honor for me to be here to introduce this panel and to be, for Columbia Global, to be co-sponsoring this event with the amazing Hong, who's of course the amazing person who's leading the Weatherhead Institute. So thank you, Hong. Really a true honor. At Columbia Global, our motto or our slogan is where thinking meets doing. And I think this event really is emblematic of that, as our goal is to foster conversations that bridge history, scholarship, and action in addressing some of the world's most complex challenges. So why this panel and why now? As you know, this panel is entitled Lessons from the U.S. Vietnam Reconciliation Roadmap for the World. I think it's important to appreciate that milestones invite reflection, not just commemoration. So today we are reflecting on this very important milestone today. And I think the U.S. Vietnam reconciliation offers some very timely global lessons that hopefully our speakers will address and discuss today, and showing us that certainly that trust can be rebuilt after conflict. So today's panel will ask, how can this experience guide others? How can it guide us in this moment in history? And what conditions help reconciliation take hold and last? And I think the answers to these two questions can matter tremendously, both locally and globally. So let me first then introduce our moderator, Professor Jean-Marie Guehenno, sitting right here next to me. And Jean-Marie, if I may, I'll use first names, but Professor is the director of the Kent Global Leadership Program on Conflict Resolution at Columbia's School of International Public Affairs at SIPA. He's a former UN Secretary General for Peacekeeping, and he's led major peacekeeping missions in global conflict zones, including in Darfur, Congo, Haiti, and elsewhere. He, as you can imagine, brings a deep experience in terms of peace building after war, and has a lot to share with us in terms of diplomacy and post-conflict recovery. Now, next to Jean-Marie is Paige Arthur. Welcome, Paige. And Paige is the Director of Programming at Columbia Global Centers, for the Columbia Global Centers, and she's based at the Columbia Global. And she's a historian by training, and she's a previous editor of Ethics and International Affairs. She's also been a deputy director of research at the International Center for Transactional Justice. She's authored many books, several books, including on identities and transition and AI for peace. And Paige works at the intersection of justice, conflict, and global engagement. Welcome, Paige. And next to her, we're very honored today to have with us Ambassador Dinh Quay, and a very distinguished diplomat, very seasoned and career diplomat. He's the former permanent representative of Vietnam to the United Nations from 2018 to 2022, and he currently serves as president of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. He's previously served as well as Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, and he brings an extensive experience in diplomacy, international relations. And then last but certainly not least, I'm going to introduce Adam Tooze. Adam is also a historian by background, and he's the chair of the committee Global Thought, one of the constituent entities of Columbia Global, and a very dear colleague. He's also the director of the European Institute at Columbia and the Shelby Cullom David Chair of History at Columbia. Adam is an amazing and prolific author. He's written several books, one that is particularly close to my heart called Shutdown, COVID-19 and the World Economy, amongst several other books as well. He's been a leading voice on history, economics, and global systems overall. So thank you all for being here today, and we have quite honored to have such a distinguished panel, and I hand it over to Jean-Marie to start the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, I owe you an apology. I'll have to leave at 3:45 sharp because I have another engagement at 4 at SIPA. But I really look forward to this panel. I'm a Frenchman. I reflect on the reconciliation between Vietnam and France. I think the two countries established diplomatic relations, restored diplomatic relations in 1973. So it takes some time between the defeat of France and that restoration of diplomatic relations. But it's a very good thing, and I know now the two countries are strategic partners. But there's nothing comparable to the reconciliation between the United States and Vietnam. I mean, a bitter war was fought, and yet the veterans were among the first to help bring together the two countries. And I think we all want to learn from that experience. And so I'll ask first Ambassador Key to tell us how you did it.
Thank you very much, the organizers, for providing me the opportunity to come here. And my special thanks to Professor Liên Hằng. A good time to come back to New York. And I arrived here about a day ago, so my time's in Hanoi time. I'm sorry about that. So talking about the reconciliations, I look up in the dictionary that reconciliation that means restoring friendly relations after the war, after hostility or misunderstanding. So if we apply that definition, we think almost the two countries already reconciled already. But the previous panel, the people brought up reconciliation going on some issues. For example, between the USG and the Vietnamese government, still 3 issues remaining. One is Agent Orange. About 20,000 people still affected by Orange Agent. The second is about the unexploded ordnance. And every year we experience about 400 cases of explosion that claim about hundreds of injuries, especially in Quang Tri province. And the third issue about the MIA for the Vietnamese. For the American MIA, that's still about more than about 1,000, in between 1,000 and 2,000. But for the Vietnamese, I think that 20,000 still remaining. And so that's 3 remain. But the greater issue of reconciliation is among the Vietnamese ourselves. The Vietnamese at home and Vietnamese here, especially in Southern California, in Texas or somewhere. So that process is going on. And Ambassador Giang stated about the policy of the government of Vietnam toward the Vietnamese overseas, and we welcome all the Vietnamese overseas to come back to join hands to build a future. And Tom Vallely raising a new statement of the General Secretary of Vietnam Communist Party, Mr. Tô Lâm, about the definition of reconciliation in a new sense. He said that reconciliation does not mean forgetting, but acknowledging the differences and join hands to build a better future. So the new thing in his statement is the acknowledging the differences. So I think that it got to send a new signal to the people that around the world, including the Vietnamese communities here in America. And we think that all the Vietnamese at home and abroad, that we have only one nation. And then we build a better future for our future generation. It's a must. It's not my generation. I'm retired already. Not the Ambassador Dung's generation. Yet we was born during the wartime in early 1960s. And then we experienced bombing in the north and we have different losses. But the young generation here, they will take care of our bilateral relation, and that is that they will tackle the greatest responsibility for that. And we're very hopeful for that. And now we're talking about the lesson for reconciliation. I look at the ChatGPT. The ChatGPT said that, I agree with him. 1, reconciliation is not an event. It is a process. It is a process of climbing up the ladder step by step, and it should be nurtured. generation by generation. And for the reconciliation between U.S. and Vietnam, we take 6 steps already. The first step is the initial contact, people coming in early 1980s. The second step is building trust. And we heard about trust from the morning. And I would like to ask question about trust of the previous ambassador, the former ambassador, Shelby, he's not here, Ambassador Clinton. My question is that what has the U.S. not trusted Vietnam? On what issue, on what problem, but he's not here. But that question struck in my mind. Okay.
Ask the question again.
Yeah. Ambassador, I heard about your presentation in that the previous panel about trust, and we understand the importance of trust in the process of reconciliation and also the process of building a future between our two countries. But my question is that what still remaining that had not what the U.S. has not trusted Vietnam at present? But later on, okay, later on. So all right. The second step is the building trust. The third step is the deepening cooperation, and then the third step is the establishing comprehensive partnership, and then now we have comprehensive and strategic partnership already. So 6 steps already. So whether this 6 steps apply to other cases of the world or not, it's yes and no, because Vietnamese people are kind of very typical people. It's a culture. We turn all our former enemy become partner. First of all, China. Yeah. We fought with China more than 20 times during 2000 years history. And now China become, the strategic partnership, comprehensive partnership, everything partnership. Okay. French after 100 years, and 90 years in Dien Bien Phu, something like that. Japan caused to the famine in 1945, and that led to the death toll of more than 2 million Vietnamese. From that, Japan now become very close. U.S. I mean, also the UK in a short while. UK fought with Vietnam in the late 1945 and early 1946, and UK now become also the strategic partnership already. So it's very difficult for Vietnam. I don't know whether other people in the world, they have the same tradition. But in the process of reconciliation between Vietnam and the U.S., that different lessons can be learned. First, the principle. The principle the two sides should observe is that first, mutual respect. The second, mutual interest. Ambassador Zhang and Ambassador Jung talking about the overlapping of interest. So I think that the principle that guided in the process of reconciliation and also in the process of building a future, also mutual benefit and also mutual respect. That's very important. And the second thing that the process of reconciliation is both top-down and bottom-up. The top-down, we need a political decision from the leader. And you mentioned about the President Carter, but a very short while. And then he changed his policy. President Ronald Reagan, no. President Bush Sr., a little bit at the end of his term. And then President Bill Clinton, great. Junior Bush, great. Obama, great. And then going on and that. So, and from our side, all the leaders that they experience in the wartime, they become the champion for the normalization. And one of the key figures is the late Prime Minister Van Kiet. Van Kiet lost his 3 sons and daughter and his wife during the wartime. And he's the champion. He's the strongest leader of Vietnam who advocate the early normalization and promotion of relations with the U.S. Who else? Winston Dung, you mentioned. Dung was a fighter during the war, and he was war injury, something like that, and so on, and others. And how about other leader, Nguyen Phu Trong? Very decisive when he make decision to upgrade our relation 2 level up. He did that. So we need a strong leadership from the top. But more than that, we need very strong supporting of our people. Okay. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese mothers who lost their 1 or 2 child, or all the child during the wartime. And thousands of American mothers who lost their child during the wartime. But they are very strong supporters. Who else? Veteran. I mean, veteran. The first veteran to come back in the initial contact in the John Vesey delegation to Vietnam in early 1980s, who make the bridge. The others, who else? War activists. And also the businesses who came to Vietnam. So without support of the ordinary people, the businesses, or the veteran, including John Kerry, John McCain, something like that, when after then they came to the politics, right? We cannot have the relation like now. So it's a kind of top-down and bottom-up meeting with a very strong interest to build the common future together, and we have now. So that I think that this election, whether it can be, the roadmap to the war or not, it's very demanding, but very ambitious. But I think it's good for the reference for other countries in the world, that if they want to make a reconciliation among themselves or between their country and other country. So I stop my statement here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'd like now to ask Adam to comment. As a specialist of Europe, where many wars have been fought, many countries have hated each other. What do you think of what has happened, and how can you compare it?
It's truly a privilege to be here on this panel. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not a natural-born American. In fact, I literally became an American last week. So to find myself, no, don't clap, please, please. Under the circumstances, there's no need for applause. But to find myself the following week on a panel commemorating one of the most traumatic events in my new country's history, speaking with distinguished colleagues and counterparts from Vietnam is quite head-turning. And I'm afraid that after the impeccably smooth in the beginning opening comments by a leading diplomat and teacher of diplomats, who then also goes to the trouble of consulting ChatGPT, and which produces its wonderful words of wisdom. You then talk to a European historian in the current moment about what we can learn from U.S. Vietnam relations, and you're going to get a grimmer picture. Because under the present circumstances, the entire question of normalization in terms of one's relations with the United States is an open question, and it's not by accident that the representation from the American side at today's meeting is as selective as it is. One doesn't need to articulate any further why it should be that way. And so thinking about this, what I was above all fascinated by is simply the sort of sense of asynchronicity in this relationship, going all the way back to the beginning of modern Vietnamese nationalism, at which point a positive relationship with America appeared possible, into the extraordinary heroic standoff between the United States in its most bullying mode as Cold War protagonist, and Vietnam literally as the hero of national liberation struggles over the entire globe. And winning in that war, which of course makes it totally different from, say, the German experience or the Italian or the Japanese experience, which is defined by the fact they lost, only then to find themselves in the 1980s impoverished, and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, almost entirely isolated. And having from that position again to rethink what Vietnam's path should be. And in due course, as you were saying, through that list of presidents, to walk into the arms of what looks like a coherent strategy of American globalization, starting with Clinton, continued with Bush, culminating in Vietnam's WTO accession in 2007, And then into the 2010s with the foundation of Fulbright, the promise of the Obama administration, TPP, and you can see where I'm going, only then in 2016 for that entire apparently coherent American synthesis to blow up in your faces and in everyone else's faces. And nowhere more has that reverberating shock been felt than in Asia, in the Asian arena, in the Southeast and the East Asian arena. And against that backdrop, to nevertheless pursue the strategy of normalization as coherently as Vietnam has, to try and make the best of the situation, to build institutions, to achieve what by anyone's standard was judged until about 12 months ago as one of the great success stories of economic globalization, bar none, right? There was Japan, there was South Korea, there was China, and then there was Vietnam. And that was the sequence. You know, you could intersperse a Bangladesh as well, if you liked. But broadly speaking, that was the sequence of Asian globalization success stories. Only then to run into, and it didn't start with Trump, right? It started with the Biden administration's wariness about registering Vietnam as a market economy as opposed to a planned economy, which was already a disappointment of last year, and into the brick wall of this utterly arbitrary set of tariff policies, which have the peculiarly insulting quality that they totally disregard the specifics of any individual player, right? It's, as we know, Washington was not actually working this through on a case-by-case basis. It was just a blanket formula applied to the entire world economy. And against that backdrop, to be again posing the question, what does this relationship mean, really is testament to your country's persistence, shall we say. I mean, truly dogged persistence in the belief that there must be a better way, there has to be a better way forward. This is an indispensable relationship, at least for you, even if on the American side this is not understood. And that, I think, is truly, it's hard to think of other parallels of that level of just dogged willingness to continue working, because it isn't the German experience. It's not the Japanese experience, because they, after all, suffered annihilating and humiliating defeat and then found themselves comfortably situated. Not Vietnam's experience. It's not the experience of either South Korea or Japan. And when we think more broadly, I don't know, of Ireland or of other significant processes of reconciliation, this is really a standout, unique case, I would argue, of a truly determined effort from this part of a player, which I understand in the new language of the current moment, Vietnam's ascendancy is being promised over the next 15 to 20 years. Perhaps I'll just conclude by commenting on the sheer self-confidence of that. That's a remarkable vision for Vietnam to be framing, but given the unreliability of the American side, that's also surely what it's going to take. I mean, the stamina, the endurance, the coherence is going to come from your side. It isn't going to come from the American side. That's surely the bitter lesson that almost all of America's partners are learning at this moment. We all may, whether it's the EU, whether it's the UK, whether it's partners in Asia, still see something that has to be invested in this relationship. But the coherence is going to have to come from the side of the other players. And that might be one-on-one. It could be hub and spokes, tactics. Vietnam has been astonishingly fast-moving in its willingness to go for bilateral relations. What I was kind of amazed to see is Vietnam's reinvention or appropriation of what I took to be the Biden strategy of kind of lattice work, lateral relations in the region, which Vietnam is also pursuing very proactively. This was thought of as a grand strategic move by the Biden team, and in fact it's Vietnam and other regional players which are pushing this. But one way or the other, those of us who hold, or who hold a candle for a more coherent American strategy are basically left hoping that you have the endurance and you have the persistence and the patience to wait out the crisis that America is going through.
Thank you. Now let's turn to you, Paige. I mean, you have studied a lot of reconciliation processes. As was mentioned, you have written on transitional justice, and I was thinking of you when the ambassador was talking about the balance between forgetting and acknowledging. So I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on what's going on between Vietnam and the United States.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jean-Marie. I'm really honored to be on this panel. I want to start by saying that I'm the daughter of a Vietnam veteran. I grew up in the shadow of the Vietnam War. My father was a career military officer, so it's something that I've always felt was a part of my life as well, in my way. And it also engaged me, I think, early on issues of kind of thinking about global responsibility and what does that mean. My take on this relationship is, partly to kind of situate it in kind of the longer term of, say, the past. I would push it past 30 years. I would push it toward the end of the Cold War, so past 35, 40 years, and understand kind of what's unique about the Vietnam experience and approach to reconciliation, but then how it also compares to many, many other contexts. I shouldn't say compares, but how it has maybe common elements with those other contexts. And I got into this field, conflict prevention and reconciliation, back in 2006. I started working at a new NGO called the International Center on Transitional Justice, which was founded by members of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think the idea was not to export a model, but was to help countries innovate their own models. And if I look at the Vietnam experience sort of in that kind of the long cold, towards the end of the Cold War, really starting with Latin America, and the way that countries like Chile and Argentina innovated their own responses to dealing with, very difficult political situations, in which dealing with a difficult past, dealing with the end of right-wing military dictatorships, what can you do that's politically feasible, that accounts for different domestic constituencies, but that also does do something to acknowledge and recognize wrongs that have been done in the past, that they tried to navigate a very narrow path in doing that. And then in South Africa, which learned the lessons from Chile and Argentina, literally people who worked on those truth commissions in Chile and Argentina, the 1980s, went to South Africa and talked with South Africans at the end of apartheid. What are the things that you can do in a very politically constrained environment? And many other countries in the global south did this, from Morocco after the years of lead, from Sierra Leone and Liberia. Look at Timor-Leste and Indonesia. After the referendum that gave Timor-Leste independence, they actually established a commission to look at the violence that took place around that referendum. And although there was no formal apology, there was a kind of moral reckoning that was able to take place. And so, for me, I see the Vietnam and U.S. experience in this kind of longer arc of innovation happening from the global south, really not responding to, not using templates of international justice that are really driven by the North or driven by the U.S. or Europe, but really innovating their own solutions that respond to their own particular circumstances. And so with that said, I wanted to just say three things that look to me like commonalities across some of these experiences, and then three things that I thought are really unique and kind of surprising for my experience. And among the commonalities, first, it's the fact that it's really, reconciliation is about trust. Now, it depends on what kind of trust has been broken. Sometimes it's between the state and citizens, if there's been a kind of military dictatorship. In a civil war, it's trust between peoples. But it's really important for trust building to happen at multiple levels, and that's what we see in the Vietnam case. So alongside formal negotiations, government-to-government dialogue, trade agreements, whatever it is you have that's bilateral in nature, at kind of a government level, there's just a multitude of these initiatives that are civil society-led. These are early initiatives by veterans, by the scientific community, by religious actors like the Quakers, people who were there in the 1980s before there was any glimmer, really, of a kind of, bilateral reconciliation. This is really important because when one level stalls, the other level can go forward. And I really want to emphasize that in this moment as maybe a hopeful comment. That's why it's important to have this kind of multi-level process going on. I think the second commonality is is really the people-to-people approaches themselves. So this, as I said, is a complement to the more formal opening that began toward the end of the Cold War. And within that, these initiatives around fact-finding, I mean, what can you really do when political space is closed? You can just start with fact-finding, documenting. And this is what scientists did on dioxins in the 1980s. International conferences, trying to understand, what the science is, documenting where hotspots were in Vietnam. This is all kind of a prelude to really be able to act when the moment actually presents itself. So those people-to-people approaches are really important. Another commonality is the issue of missing persons as an early issue of collaboration. This is actually very common in post-war contexts. There seems to be this kind of fundamental human understanding that identifying the remains and giving information to families is something that everybody can agree on as a kind of common moral boundary. And then the last thing is that these issues and these efforts are really nationally conceived, and they're responsive to domestic political dynamics. So that is common, I think, across these different approaches. Now, for what I see as unique, maybe this is more important, really the role of veterans. I really have never heard of veterans being such a positive force in a post-war context. Usually veterans are a problem. If they're on the winning side, they are wanting pensions or land, which in many countries is very difficult for a state to afford. If they're on the losing side, then well, what do you do with them? Do you integrate them into a new armed forces? Do you punish them? And so it's a kind of thorny, and of course on both sides here, it's not as though the veterans community is a monolith or was unproblematic. I'm going to put that aside just to say that there are veterans who stepped up and played a very positive role here, and that is a lesson for the world. I mean, that is really, I think, quite unique in this situation. I would say also that putting squarely the issue of environmental impact of the conflict, particularly around Agent Orange, and that's a kind of a decades-long, very long-term issue and solution, and the role of the scientific community as a force for trust building, not just for science, but for building that people-to-people trust. That's quite unique in the Vietnamese context. And then the last thing, which is maybe the most important, this is actually going back to Ambassador Quay's comments, is really about that reconciliation is a long-term process. There's no magic bullet. There's no Truth and Reconciliation Commission or reparations program, or there's no kind of ad hoc institution that delivers this. It is a decades-long process that is going to see setbacks along the way. That is very common. It's a question of, again, if you have that multi-track or multi-layered process where if there is a setback, then efforts can still be taken forward on a different level. And so I just wanted to end by, acknowledging, I know there was someone earlier who was an ambassador earlier was talking about the courage of people, especially early on, to make these connections, to do the early trust building. And I want to stress that this is a politically, especially early on, a very politically risky situation when you're dealing in post-conflict contexts. And so I wanted to celebrate and acknowledge all of the people who really took that risk and who were courageous enough to step forward and to do this. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Well, you all use the word trust. It's really, it connects all three panelists. And I want to ask the ambassador a follow-up question on trust. Because you were wondering what, on the American side, what was that prevented trust to be built. But I'm tempted to ask you, not for now, but...
The Americans has not trusted Vietnam yet.
Yes. I'm tempted to ask you, in the early days when the reconciliation began, what was the trigger that made you trust the United States?
I think that several factions that make Vietnam trust the United States. That in early 1980s, Vietnam facing with a lot of difficulties. We're facing with the border war with China in the north, and the border war with Khmer Rouge in the southwest, and then we're under the economic embargoes by the U.S. And we're also facing with the mistake committed by ourselves in the economic management, sense of planning economy, and make it nearly collapse. and we're facing with the the supply. Our main supply from the Soviet Union is cut down. So in about the late 1980s, we are facing with a lot of difficulties. The system nearly collapsed. Then we think that what is the way out? We need to have relations with all other people, including the Southeast Asian country. But if we are not normalize relations with the U.S., whether or not the Southeast Asian country and also Northeast Asian country like Japan can help it or not. So it's a kind of a must of the situation that forces us. And the second thing that, as I reiterated earlier, that is the culture of Vietnam. The culture of Vietnam that we have to, restore normal relations with all our former enemies. The reason is very simple, that we fought with all the big guys, not small guys. China, Japan, French, and UK, okay, not small guys. And then we have to live with the big guy. We cannot live without the big guy. So it, year and year and century develop that kind of culture for Vietnamese. So every time we fought with China, we won them, and then we started the reconciliation from ourselves. Yeah, so that is the kind of culture, and we do the same thing. So I mean the two factors.
Thank you. Adam, you also used the word trust, and you noted, now fast forwarding to now, how the remarkable example of Vietnam is this dogged persistence, that were your words, to continue to try to build something with the United States. What lessons do you draw from other countries whose trust in the United States has also been blown up by what's happening?
If I may, I'd like to pick up where the ambassador left off and dig a little deeper by way of a European analogy, which is that this trust is also we think of it, it's a term which evokes human emotion and human psychology, but in the sort of world that we're talking about here, it's eminently political. And one of the things that has to happen is that you move from a construction of the world as, say, a two-block model to one in which you begin to reconfigure and think differently about the way in which Vietnam sits in relation to all the different players. I mean, you use that phrase, Vietnam has to have relation. This is a major doctrinal shift within the thinking of a party like the Vietnamese Communist Party. It's a major doctrinal shift in the Republican Party in the early 1970s when Kissinger and Nixon opened the door to a relationship with China, when they say, actually, we need to be in a position where we can build a relationship with China so as to outflank the Soviet Union. It's a huge shift also in the ideology of Christian democracy in Germany in the 70s and 80s to accommodate itself to the idea that they should build a working relationship with East Germany as a way ultimately of buying into the program of overcoming the divide, which was originally a social democratic program and was then absorbed by the Christian Democrats as well. So I think we can't avoid talking about politics, and that, in a sense, is the problem of dealing with the United States right now, of all its parties, is that there is one side of the American democratic political system, which I think is normally untrustworthy. It's the Democrats, and they do normal politics, and they will think through policy in the way you would expect international players to do. And it's a mixed bag, and there's a fair element of hypocrisy, but it's a kind of predictable international actor around which you can then engage in reasonable trust-building exercises. But the really singular moment that we're in is that so much of the politics of the current moment feels like a hallucination. And the problem with a hallucination is your most deep issue is, do you trust what you see or not? Like, can you literally take it at face value is the problem. Whatever they're saying, you just don't know whether it's for real. And if you knew it was just plainly antagonistic, you might be able to build a relationship to it. It would be a difficult one, but as you're saying, Vietnam has dealt with some very difficult partners. But in this case, you don't know whether it's actually a clown show. It's kayfabe, it's a joke, it's wrestling, it's kind of just a made-up persiflage. And that is that's a new problem, I think, and this is where I think, Paige, you're absolutely spot on. That is where the multi-layer trust building Because at some layer, the point right now, the question right now is American society still sane? Which bits of it are sane? What bits of it are not? What power and what influence do they have? And how do you move forward from there? So it's a very deep set of analytical problems that face America's partners in the current moment, specifically around this. I mean, it was Wafaa's phrase to me earlier on. It was like, it feels like a hallucination. If you've seen who they've just appointed to the UN, you'll know what we're talking about.
So, Paige, when you coined that word multi-layered to describe what's needed, but this multi-layered relationship where human beings, emotions do matter. Now we are seeing, and that was noted by the ambassador, new generations coming. So the emotions with respect to Vietnam, United States are not the same as the emotions of those who lived through that experience, or whose parents lived through that experience. And so from what you have observed in countries which have reconciled, I mean, how do you see that moving from one generation to the other, so that the efforts in one generation is continued in the following generation?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think in many countries, and I can't speak to Vietnam's experience, but there are intergenerational effects of these kinds of conflicts, and they've been documented, they've been studied even from a medical and a public health perspective, about what happens to countries, to the children of people who've been traumatized, and particularly on a large scale. I think specifically of countries like Liberia, and the really terrible civil war that they went through in Sierra Leone, and then you have to think about the kinds of interventions that are needed to support young people growing up in those places. Again, I can't speak to Vietnam. I have to say it does seem different, and this could be very much a cultural, again, part of a kind of cultural uniqueness. Not to say that there's no trauma or no intergenerational trauma, but it could be a very different phenomenon due to culture. I think the other part of your question, Jean-Marie, I mean, I have a question really for people in the audience, about the current moment. And I've reflected also on the fact, as I mentioned, I'm the daughter of a Vietnam veteran, but, that's an older generation, and people are passing. My father has passed, people who are involved in the movement, to really, to build that trust and to keep these, and to do the recognition and the acknowledgement, the kind of moral piece of this. Is there still a constituency for that here in our country? And I can't answer that question. I don't know. It's a question I put to all of you, the extent to which, this kind of very ahistorical approach to foreign policy that seems to say, that the past is over. That stuff we don't care about that. Let's move on from those issues. They don't matter, and let's just move forward with whatever it is we have on our minds. But there should be typically some kind of domestic constituency or pressure to kind of push back on that. And so that's my question.
Adam.
I was just prompted by something Paige said, thinking about that idea of generation. So just very briefly to want to say that a fundamental element in the American experience of Vietnam is, after all, not just the veterans that fought, but the mass mobilization of Americans against the war. And that mass mobilization of Americans against the war shook all of society. It merged with the civil rights movement, and it shook our campus, Columbia University's campus, more dramatically than any event up to October 7th and the struggles which we've seen here over the last 2 years. And I think that also has to be said, right? That one of the things that made, to answer Jean-Marie's question, one of the things that perhaps might have given the Vietnamese a sense that the Americans could be trusted is that some Americans took the risk and were courageous enough to oppose the unjust war. And that was the healthiest sign of American democracy, to my mind, and the struggles that were fought over that. And that struggle is still ongoing. And then and now, it's a highly unbalanced struggle. And in this room, on this occasion, it seems worth saying that.
Thank you for saying that. The flame is there. It's still
I don't know about the flame, but like just the reality of that.
Yes. So I should open to the floor because I'm sure that in the room there are many questions. So if you have a question, stand up, and there are microphones on both sides, and identify yourself and ask your question as concise and focused as possible. Yes, sir.
Thank you for a very interesting panel. My name is Edward Miller. I'm a historian at Dartmouth College. I'm a specialist in Vietnam War history, modern Vietnamese history. I've written both about the war and about this topic of U.S. Vietnam relations.
Yeah. Thank you for your article. It was my main briefing pack for today.
Oh, well.
I was literally reading it at lunch. It's an excellent article.
I'm delighted that someone's read it. So that's very reassuring to know. I recognize that the topic of this panel is reconciliation between the United States and Vietnam, and I agree that this is a very remarkable story. At the same time, when I think about the Vietnam War and the issue of reconciliation, we also, as Paige has alluded to, need to think about reconciliation within nations, because this conflict was so divisive within both the United States and Vietnam. And it seems to me that there is far less progress, both within the United States and within Vietnam, on reconciliation with this. So, as Professor Tooze has mentioned, the Vietnam War did generate an enormous anti-war movement, the largest in American history, but it also generated huge reaction, a huge pro-war movement. And the legacies of that division are still very much with us today. There is no consensus narrative in the United States about the Vietnam War. Similarly, in Vietnam, my current research now is about civil warfare in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was, among other things, a civil war among Vietnamese. And this is not even officially acknowledged in Vietnam today. So my question is, if you accept this proposition that reconciliation has not made nearly as much progress within countries as it has between the countries, what are the implications of that for understanding U.S.-Vietnam reconciliation as a model or perhaps as a source of inspiration in this larger question of peace building and reconciliation, which of course is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to? Ambassador, you have a comment.
I think a very small comment that I think a reconciliation within the country or within community in one country is much more difficult than between nation and nation. And I would like to add up one point about the role of the mass the movement in the U.S. and the trust of Vietnam. I think that Ho Chi Minh would differentiate very clearly since the war against French, that to differentiate between the French people and French government, different. And then American government, successive government, and American people. And we were struck about the incident like Morrison burned himself. Yeah. And I think that every people in Vietnam knows about the case. So we understand that we have a lot of good friends in U.S., not only the enemy, but a lot of friends there. Thank you.
This, in fact, is also what the U.S. military learned from the war. So the U.S. military begin reading Clausewitz, they begin reading Mao, they begin reading the classics of Marxist thinking about war because of the highly sophisticated way in which the Vietnamese side, in fact, did understand this. So this is a case of an extraordinary transfer of knowledge. The Tet Offensive, which the American military celebrate as a victorious defeat of a Vietnamese offensive that is read as a political disaster in the United States because of the reverberations within the peace movement. But this lesson about the inner and the outer is key also from European experience. If you think about the experience of France after World War II with the profound divisions within French society or Italian society in the aftermath, or the same in the Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, where again the tensions that run within communities are the ones that really go on festering and burning.
Yeah, in France it took decades actually to come to terms with the fact that France was deeply divided. The myth of a French all behind de Gaulle and resistance it didn't blow up until Chagrin et la Pitié, and so that's decade after the war. Any comment on the question?
I mean, just to say, I can't, again, I don't know enough about Vietnam to talk about the internal dynamics of reconciliation there. And I am not also an expert on the U.S. dynamics. I'm only speaking from my personal kind of perspective. And I think what you've highlighted is very important. And I didn't realize myself that there was still, such a divide in our country about the meaning of the war, whether the justice of the war, because just anecdotally from my perspective, kind of growing up in the military, there seemed to me to be a recognition, actually, that if not immoral, it certainly was a mistake, on some level. And then there was, of course, from what I could tell, a closing of the gap between I think a lot of rancor around the fact that there were anti-war protesters, but over time an understanding about why there was an anti-war movement. But I could be wrong about that. Again, that's anecdotal.
Thank you. Thank you for your very moving comments this morning, through the afternoon. It's been very powerful. I just want to comment and follow what Ed said. I sort of look at Trump's election as the product of the stab in the back argument we've been having in this country for the past 50 years over the war in Vietnam. It would be very easy to prove that at great length. The same forces that questioned what happened at that time are part of the stream that created him. And I think that's a very powerful, sort of lost cause, if you will, for those of us who are familiar with the history of the Civil War, that kind of phenomena. And what I was struck with earlier was the people who fought hard to have reconciliation with Vietnam were those of us who fought the war. There was no one else interested in that at the time. And I can remember Vietnam Veterans Against the War. I can remember going to events in the aftermath of the fall of Saigon in '75 when people were talking about Agent Orange, when people were discovering that their kids had Agent Orange. There was a professor here, good buddy of mine, who fought in Vietnam, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. He was a Cat Marine, Leo Cawley. He died of Agent Orange. All right, so those of us who had that experience, we were the ones pushing to have reconciliation. Way before John Kerry, who we all know was part of BBAW and then he split from it, and certainly Senator McCain, way before then, those of us were talking about reconciliation. So I think the grassroots in our society has to be taken into consideration, and the grassroots has effects having a phenomenon like Donald Trump elected, who, as I say, I think you could conclusively argue is from that stream of the stab in the back argument in our country. Thanks.
Yeah. Over to you.
Hi, my name is Artemis. I'm a history student in Columbia undergrad under Professor Tooze and Professor Hong. And my question is, does the case of Vietnam have the potential to set a kind of generalized framework for reconciliation? And for that matter, can a general framework for reconciliation exist?
Who wants to answer?
I think we should take all the questions.
Maybe we take a few more questions. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Walter. I'm an undergrad here. My question was about, you spoke about like generations, and as someone who was born and grew up in this century, my question is about, in a case like Vietnam, where you transition from a people completely opposed to the United States to one that's now in partnership with it, how do you go about teaching sort of my generation and the next generation, especially when you have the physical sort of remnants of the U.S. attack? We talked about, I think the previous panel talked about the bomblets left over that still injure people today, right? So how do you go about teaching a balance between the suffering imposed by the U.S. bombing and U.S. Sort of task force there, and of course the modern relationship of the U.S. as a partner in achieving Vietnamese prosperity and independence? Thanks.
Hello, my name is Julian. I'm a student here in Columbia in economics and history, and I'm in Professor Lien Hong's class on Vietnam War. And my question was, as we were talking about, as we saw from this gentleman, there's like clearly a lot more, I guess, enthusiasm for reconciliation from soldiers than perhaps in other conflicts. I was wondering if you had any thoughts as to why and to how you could apply that to this reconciliation, I guess, in other places, because we also talked about how like techniques and ideas from various other like wars or conflicts can be applied or spread to the reconciliation process of future ones. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's. Yes.
Jeremy, you need to head out.
Yes.
So we should not embarrass you. So you
Okay.
yeah.
So I'm sorry not to hear the answers because I'd be very interested. But I'll go now. Yes.
Why don't we just take these other questions?
Are you going to remember?
Yeah.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Erin Phuong Steinhauer. I'm from Vietnam Society, came up from Washington, D.C. Of course, the 50th anniversary, the pain still linger in among many of us. And yesterday I was at the Vietnam Wall, and I saw, actually we were there for a silent vigil in the evening. But earlier in the day, we saw thousands of Vietnamese Americans out there really commemorating the 50th anniversary with many of the old flags flying everywhere and many speeches, etc. And I just wanted to follow up on the professor's question, which is reconciliation among Vietnamese, not just inside Vietnam, but really Vietnamese in Vietnam and overseas Vietnamese, where there are millions of people now. Here in the U.S., there are 40% of those who are Vietnamese in the diaspora born in America now. And as we talk about reconciliation and the trauma of war, it passes intergenerationally. So my question is, where do we stand in terms of the progress and the approach to reconciliation among Vietnamese? And perhaps that's more of a question for Mr. Dang, but anyone could answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
All right. Hi, I'm Chin. I'm currently a student under Director Hang, and I'm also a student worker for Weatherhead. So this is kind of to everyone, but specifically to Paige, because you talked about how efforts to address the moral and social ramifications from the war often come from the people down. It's a multi-layer process, and especially from those who are affected by the war. And I think this means that this often absolves the U.S. government effort in order to address those moral and social ramifications. We see how Ambassador Wee talks about, you know, the aftermath of Agent Orange and like the landmines, and also given the fact that we've named the war as Vietnam War to absolve our direct intervention in that effort. And so my question is, given that kind of like lack of moral responsibility for the U.S. government to address those moral ramifications, to what extent then has this reconciliation process been a moral lesson for the U.S. in engaging with other developing countries? I mean, we've seen as Afghanistan and currently now, has this actually resulted in a deterrent measure to reduce harm?
Thank you. Yes, please.
My name is Keith Taylor. I'm a professor emeritus at Cornell University. And I appreciate very much your panel because it made me think about my own experience. I had to go in the Army back in the 60s, and I served in Vietnam. And when I came back, I went to the university to study about Vietnamese history, and I wrote a book about ancient Vietnam. And I ended up being invited to Hanoi in 1986 by the Institute of Archaeology and the Institute of History, and began to get to know some of the scholars in Vietnam. And it was, for me, when I think back to reconciliation, it's a very sort of subterranean sort of level. But among the scholars that I got to know in Hanoi, and then my subsequent trips to Vietnam and living in Vietnam for a few years in the 90s, I got to know them very well, not just colleagues, but friends. Very prominent, interesting Vietnamese scholars like Tran Quoc Vo and Haventon and Fanhuile, they taught me a lot about their country. One memory that I just wanted to bring up is when I first went to Hanoi after the war in '86, I was in this hotel and I met a woman who some of you may have heard about. Her name was Ngo Batang. She was a South Vietnamese lawyer who was very active in organizing war widows and orphans against the war. And she was actually a member of the Communist Party. And I met her in a hotel because she was up from Saigon to attend she's a member of the National Assembly at that point, to attend the National Assembly. So we had a very interesting conversation. And she said, you know, it's very important that you're here. It's a first step. And I didn't really understand what she meant by first step. But now, when I look what we're talking about here, it was a first step in a long process of reconciliation that among scholars, there's a whole new generation of scholars. Many of them here spend a lot of time in Vietnam working in archives and libraries. And I think at that level, from scholar to scholar, we respect each other not because of any ideological commitment, but because we want to find out the truth. We want to study and to know what really happened.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jack. I'm a current history major in CC. I'm currently in a Lien Hong's Vietnam War class, and Professor Tooze, I was in your War of Germany class last semester. It was a really good course. And you mentioned October 7th, how we haven't seen this kind of turmoil on campus since the Vietnam War. And I'm just wondering if there are any lessons we can take from the grassroots reconciliation efforts between the U.S. and Vietnam, and if we can apply those lessons to October 7th turmoil and what we're going through today.
Thank you. And maybe last question. Go ahead, please. Yes.
Hello. Just a short question, but I wanted to re-emphasize the missing persons process and seeing that as learning that is one of the first steps in engaging with reconciliation. And so I was wondering, in terms of the future, when uncertainty arises in specific locations such as Southeast Asia, do you think that Vietnam's experience with the U.S. could lend support and better understanding with addressing issues that occur in the future, and how Vietnam could utilize this experience from the legacy of war to become someone of experience and wisdom to deal with these things? And the people that have worked within this can also say that they have the experience and wisdom to deal with these things.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to turn to our panel, and maybe we'll go from Adam onwards and pick the question that you feel most suited, your interests or expertise, or the one you like best.
In response to many of those wonderful questions, I was sitting here thinking about how difficult it still is for us to talk about the politics of the situation. How difficult it still remains to acknowledge that this is, after all, not just a matter of reconciliation. It's not just a matter of diplomacy. It's about the question of how the United States deals with a proud, powerful, victorious, Communist Party-led nation. And that was the central question of the Cold War. And we somehow buried that under the myth that the West won the Cold War, which may have been true in Europe, but was just patently never true in Asia, not in Korea, not in Vietnam, and not with regard to China. And that question is back now with a vengeance. And it strikes me that we still don't know how to deal or talk about this, though it is the structuring reality of every interaction that you have, either with Vietnam or with China in the current moment. Everything goes through that prism until we grow up and find ways of talking earnestly and seriously about this, it seems to me we're stuck, or we are at other levels that Paige so beautifully laid out for us, where all of those relationships are very sincere, very deep, but in some senses go past the level. And the power is, it's not a question of the above, the abstract, the big, it's the concrete reality of what it actually means to deal with the Vietnamese state and the Vietnamese government, or the Chinese state and the Chinese government, and the people that make up that power structure, how their professional managerial class is recruited, how their elite is formed, right? Until we deal with that, we're the Germans would say, you're dancing around the hot porridge. You're not dealing with the substance. I'm afraid I'll just speak to one other point, the very, I think, heartfelt question from Hang and my joint student, so glad to see there's so many of them in the room, about lessons from this process for our current difficulty in dealing with October 7th. And if you follow that same hard-nosed logic that I've just tried to insist on to its conclusion, I'm afraid the conclusions from that are quite pessimistic, because the situations are not analogous. This is the fact, right? Vietnam defeated the United States, asserted itself, won victory, and then negotiated. And that is not the reality that we are dealing with. It's as though Egypt won in 73, right? It didn't. And so that, I think, is the fundamental difference. And it's important to emphasize those facts, because otherwise we're not facing. It's not the same as Ireland. It's not the same as South Africa. This is because of the military history that is so difficult to cope with, that your father experienced firsthand. It's a defeat.
It's interesting. It makes me wonder also, we talked a lot about trust and between Vietnam and the U.S., but also I think there's an aspect of the confidence that the Vietnamese people had and Vietnam had in entering this whole process by the results of the war. I mean, there was a certain confidence that also guided their path forward. Go to Paige, and then we'll end with you, Ambassador.
Yeah, let's give the last word to Ambassador.
You'll have the last word.
So my head is still spinning from, discovering here that the stab in the back theory is still animating American politics as strongly as it is. So thank you for, I guess, for learning that. It's quite sad. I wanted to address two of the questions. One is there a general framework for reconciliation? I would say no, and I think the reason is because we deal with different kinds of political circumstances, and it's something I've written about in the past, how the type of transition that a country might be going through shapes the kind of claims that victims might make, whether it's a right-wing military dictatorship in Chile and Argentina, that's a specific type of repression, very state-centered, and the kind of transition that flows from that is a kind of elite-packed transition. And so you get certain types of reconciliation initiatives that emerge out of that you don't get from the post-communist transitions in Eastern Europe or from post-Civil War transitions on the African continent, or what we see in Vietnam. So, I think there's some core principles you can identify around trust building and acknowledgement. I think acknowledgement is really core, but I don't think there's a template, and other people do disagree with me on that, but I don't think there is. And then when it comes to the issue of diaspora communities, this is a thorny issue in other contexts. I won't speak to Vietnam. Again, I don't know enough about it. Because sometimes diaspora communities exist for a reason, because they've left because they were not welcome, and they feared for their safety and security. In other cases, it's because they're refugees fleeing a conflict. That's a kind of a different situation. Once the conflict is over, then they feel comfortable to go back. In terms of diasporas, in the more difficult situations, I think some of the techniques are things like amnesties, things like guarantees of non-repetition, so some kind of institutional reforms that then would kind of guarantee safety and security for people who return. these are very difficult political issues. The issue of amnesty is a very, very difficult political issue. And so it's not surprising that these, kind of get stuck over time. So those were the two that I wanted to.
Thank you, Paige. And then we'll go to Ambassador.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you very much. I pick a couple of points. One is about the reconciliation among the Vietnamese. Since the war ended in 1975, the government of Vietnam, they introduced a lot of policies to encourage and welcoming the people overseas to come back home, visit. And I think that majority of people already come home or visiting or doing business or helping their family member on one way or another. I believe that I work here in the U.S. 2 terms, about 7 years. I met with different people, and I believe that about a very small portion of the Vietnamese American here, they are not fully reconciled with the government, not with the people. So, and I think the government of Vietnam and the party that try our best, and we continue to try our best to welcome them to back home, right? And put the past aside and acknowledging the differences and join hands to build the future. Now we have only one nation already, one country, one nation. But that process is kind of two-way traffic. We try our best, and we need the other people who not reconciled also try themselves to overcome their own story to come back with the nation. I think, and we hope that. And today we see a lot of young representative of young generation who come here, and with thank Liên Hang and thank for Columbia to teach them about history in this way. So they understand about that, and I think that they will going on and with building a good relation between our two countries and good relation between different countries in the world. That is your future, and this is also our expectation and on your future here, right? And a couple of points about the role of veteran. I think that the role of veteran here is great, but also the veteran in Vietnam. Vietnam, we have a kind of old people war. So I think all people experience are veterans. And the other thing that the role of the grassroots people, during the war in 21 years, we lost about 3 million. Most of them are civilians. And here you lost 57,000. Okay, they are right. So that, the role of the mass people, especially people is suffering the most in the Mekong River Delta or in the countryside. They allow the reconciliation going on, and they welcome people that are coming back. That is a great thing already. So again, I think reconciliation among our people still an issue, but we need two-way traffic. We need to both sides, and to try our best. And I think that I'm talking about the government, and we continue to try our best. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all our speakers. I think for me personally, I think it's been a great honor to be with such amazing people today, and speakers and the moderator, but also all the audience here. And thank you for those who've shared personal experiences. I think the lesson is that conflict and wars end, but they don't really end. There's a legacy and a history, and it stays for many, many, many years. And it does take the goodwill and determination of people at the grassroots at every level to try to reconcile between countries and within countries. And I'm heartened that there's so many young people in the audience who are interested in the particular history of Vietnam, but I think also they're interested in the whole topic overall. And that gives us great hope that there's the information, the knowledge, the experience is going from one generation to the next. And we can only hope for the future when all of you will be leaders, hopefully, guiding us to a better future. So thank you all for being here. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Hung.